So there's God again with the sun behind him, because he's associated with the solar consciousness, and he's creating all these strange, wonderful creatures, and you know, it's a, and people say, well, you know, the idea of God as an old man in the sky, let's say, that's primitive. It's much more better to think about it as a, much more better? Jesus. Anyways, it's more sophisticated to think of the divine essence as a disembodied spirit or something like that. But you know, that's not so obvious either, because as I already pointed out, there isn't anything that's more complicated than a human being. And so the idea that the divine is something that's at least as complicated as a human being strikes me as something that's actually quite reasonable. And I know it's a metaphor, although I don't know to what degree it is a metaphor, and it's also something that's embodied. And that's also a very interesting notion, you know, because it's become increasingly obvious as we've tried to do such things as produce artificial intelligence, that it's very difficult to produce an intelligence or perhaps a consciousness that isn't embodied in some manner. It can't be just a spirit without form. And I think that's part of the reason too why Christianity puts so much emphasis at the end of time on the resurrection of the body, because there's a drive in there to ennoble the idea of the body, not just the spirit, the consciousness that floats abstractly above the body, but to say that, no, you can't do that. You can't just shed that part of you that's heavy and material, so to speak, and leave it behind as if it's of no value. You have to ennoble that as well. And that idea is also linked to the representation of God as a human being, and as a wise human being, and as something that's embodied. And so, at least from the metaphorical perspective, I don't think it's reasonable just to brush your hands across it and say, well, that's primitive. Because I don't think it is. I don't think it's primitive at all. And then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And it's our, because, well, this is part of the priestly story. There's, as I said, a number of sources for the Old Testament. And in the priestly version, if I remember correctly, it's Elohim. That may be wrong. It doesn't matter, but precisely it doesn't matter, because the notion is that the God who's in the background of this story has a kind of plurality of being, right? And it looks like the idea of monotheism arose with great difficulty across time, because there are lots of powers, and the idea that there's a power of powers was something that it wasn't easy for people to figure out, you know, and because what's constant across sources of power? Well, some kind of meta power, but it's hard to figure out what that is, and that's what's being represented by the movement, as far as I can tell, from polytheism to monotheism. It's the observation that there are powers that determine the destiny of people, at least in part, that you're subject to. And then the idea that there's something common across all those powers that you can represent, partly, say, with the idea of the sun rising in the morning and fighting its way out of the darkness at night, and that's associated with consciousness and sovereignty. There's see, one of the things that bothers me about simple-minded atheism, and I would say the simple-minded atheism is of the sort that regards these stories as nothing but simple superstitions, is that it's very, very poorly informed. Because whatever these stories are, they are not merely simple superstitions. They weren't conjured up by some cabal of priests to bamboozle the masses, even though they were used for that purposes from time to time. It's much, much more complicated than that. They have a very ancient lineage, and they're tied together with all sorts of other stories. And there's an emergent wisdom in them, and I think the right way to view them is as the birthplace of sophisticated philosophical ideas. And so you have to wrestle with these stories. You can't just... And I said already that I'm going to be as rational as I possibly can in my discussion of these stories, and not refer to anything metaphysical except when that's absolutely necessary, even though I don't want to eliminate the possibility of a metaphysical reality, because I think that's premature. But you have to take the story seriously if you're going to approach the problem properly. You can't just casually dismiss them. It's not appropriate. And so,
if you like this video, please give this a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more content like it, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and have a beautiful day.